Hi, it's Addie from Pronto, and today I'm going to be showing you how to create seamless repeat patterns using Procreate. I do have a starter Procreate canvas file available that has a few things set up specifically for this project, but I'm also going to walk you through how you can set those parameters in any canvas so that you can create a repeat pattern of any dimension and resolution. Let's get into it. To help with the demonstration and to allow you to jump in and follow along, I have shared this Procreate canvas that I have on the screen right now. It's set up with selections already saved. And it also has some layers for what we're specifically painting today. But I also want to show you how to set up your canvas to create these repeats so that you can do this with any canvas size and any resolution. So back in my gallery, I am going to select the standard square canvas size from the pre-selections list. So this is a 2048 by 2048 pixel canvas set to 300 dpi. Now, because Procreate is primarily a drawing program, it doesn't have some of the tools that you would typically want when creating patterns. However, by using a few clever tricks within the program, we're going to be able to create a perfectly repeating pattern that is totally seamless without any guesswork. So to set up a brand new canvas for this, you just need one layer to start and begin by dragging a color to fill the entire layer. Then tap the transform tool, and before we transform anything, you're going to want to make sure that the transform setting is on uniform so it will scale proportionately and also that magnetics are turned on. And then over here, you're going to be sure that the interpolation is set to bilinear. This essentially dictates how the pixels will render as you move and scale them. So setting it to bilinear will ensure the least amount of distortion. Now grab one of the corner nodes, starting with the lower right corner, and drag this inward toward the center, reducing the scale until the square snaps to 50%. This is how you're going to be able to ensure an absolutely crisp selection, and it'll make sure that your repeats are totally seamless. From here, you can tap the transform arrow to release the square, and then in the layers panel, select the layer contents. Now you can select the layer contents a couple of different ways. You can either tap the layer to bring up the side menu and choose select from the menu, or you can use two fingers to press and hold on the layer until it selects the contents. Once the lower selection toolbar appears, if you tap save and load here, you can then tap the plus sign to save this selection. Then tap the selection tool to exit this selection, and we're going to repeat for the remaining quadrants. You can use color drop to fill in the empty space outside this square to fill the remaining part of the layer. And then use the transform tool to scale the layer contents, this time dragging from the lower left corner. Scale it until it snaps to 50%, and then tap the transform tool once again to release the object. Then in the layers panel, select the layer contents and go down and save this as your second selection. Now we're going to repeat for the third quadrant using color drop to fill and then tapping the transform tool. Now, if you shift the layer slightly or scale it down a bit without snapping to 50%, it's definitely best to go back and undo these moves rather than pushing forward trying to correct them or realign it. Even the slightest shift or misalignment can throw off the precision of the scale and the selection and might result in a seam in your pattern later on. So scale it down to 50%, tap into the layers panel, select the layer contents, and save the selection. Now we'll repeat for the last quadrant. Once you have your 4 saved selections, you can clear this square from the layer. And before we dive into using that pre-made canvas, I'm going to run through the steps of creating a pattern here in a super simplified way, so we just have that basic knowledge under our belt. To create this pattern, I am going to add in a second layer and then select both of these layers and tap group. And then on the lower layer, I am going to use color drop to fill the bottom layer. Moving on to the second layer, with this purple color, I'm going to use the Vincent painter brush and create a simple pattern of these repeating plus signs. Now, you'll generally want to distribute the elements of your pattern across the canvas, but a key thing to remember as you are working in this initial step and later on is to stay away from crossing over the edges. You can get close, but don't draw over the edges. Once I've pretty much filled my pattern, I'm going to flip the quadrants to create the actual repeat. So to do this, in my layers panel, I'm going to collapse the group, and then keeping the group selected, I'm going to tap the selection tool. Then on the toolbar down here, under Save and Load, I'm going to tap Selection 1. From here, I'm going to tap the Transform tool, and instead of moving or scaling anything, I'm just going to tap on this bottom bar to flip this horizontally and then flip it vertically. So the outside corner becomes the center of the pattern. And then I'm tapping the Transform tool once again to release the selection. Now we're going to repeat those steps for the remaining 3 quadrants. Once they are all flipped, you can go back into the layer group and you can move the elements around, add more, rescale the elements, whatever you need to do to fill in the gaps and kind of perfect the pattern. Then to test it out and see how the pattern looks as a repeat, we're going to go into the layers panel, duplicate the layer group, and then tap the duplicate to bring up the side menu and then select flatten. And this becomes our test layer. Then I'm going to duplicate this layer so that I have 4 total flattened layers. And just like before, I am going to use my transform tool to scale each layer down until it snaps to 50%. This is a super easy way to align the pattern without having to do any guesswork or manually move things around. Now you can see once I'm done, the seams are totally invisible. And so that's the really nice thing about using the Snap to magnetics and the uniform selection is that it's completely precise. So now switching back to work in the pre-made canvas, I am going to go ahead and hide the guide reference layer. This canvas already has the saved selections created, so we can just jump into drawing our pattern. In the layer group on the background layer, I am going to color drop to fill the layer with this light peach color. And then starting on my clouds layer, I'm going to use a white color, and for my brush, I'm using the Big Fat Pencil. I have the brush size set to 30% here. Now this brush is super pressure sensitive, so even at this larger size, I'm able to create these larger puffy clouds and then also narrowed tapered bits along the ends. Once I've drawn these clouds, I'm also going to reposition them. My goal when making pattern repeats is always to have a relatively even distribution of elements across the canvas, and sometimes it's hard to judge when you're drawing them out. So it helps to separate them out onto different layers if you're able to, and that allows you to make adjustments really easily and really quickly. Now on a new layer, I'm going to switch to this gray color and paint in some darker clouds. When drawing these elements, I kind of like to work largest to smallest. So my clouds are my biggest elements, and we'll work our way down to fill in with smaller and smaller shapes. Next, I'm moving up to my starbursts layer, and I'm actually going to duplicate this layer because I want to separate out the line work and the color fill of these elements. If you have limited layers, you can totally paint these all in one, or you can combine other layer elements together. Starting on the upper layer, I am using white and the deliciously inky brush. The size here I have set to about 2%. Now I'm drawing in little planet and star elements here using the quick shape feature, so waiting until it snaps into a circle or a crescent before releasing my pencil. Next, I'm going to draw in a bunch of these smaller circles as little bubbles. Prints and patterns are fun because you can mix a bunch of different elements and play with some abstract shapes, and it doesn't really have to make sense. So what we're going for here is a dreamy, whimsical look. Moving down to my lower starburst layer, I'm going to use this darker orange-yellow color and stay on the deliciously inky brush. Now I'm going to fill all of these shapes so that it looks like there's a liquid filling them out part way. So I'm only drawing the fill to around halfway or so, and then curving the top edge. Next, I'm going to work on an empty layer beneath this one. Again, if you have layer constraints, you can do this all in the same layer. I'm going to use a slightly darker color to draw in depth and surface area of this liquid fill. Now moving down to the leaves layer, I am choosing a softer green color and I'm going to switch to the grungy pencil. I have my brush size here set to 1%, and I'm just going to sketch in some sprigs of greenery all over the canvas. Now down on the splotches layer, I am using this purple and I'm going to switch to a pattern brush from this set. So this set has a bunch of different pattern brushes that can be fun to incorporate into your own larger pattern. So it can be a good way to fill out the pattern. For this, I'm using the spot marks brush and I'm going to scatter these evenly across the canvas. I'm layering some of them on top of the clouds. I'm also going to switch to the leafy pattern brush and using the same color, add some of these clusters in. Now to make these look a little more natural, I'm going to switch to the eraser tool on the big fat pencil brush and clean up some of these sharp edges and remove any leaves that are only partially drawn. So now that the canvas is pretty much full of elements, I'm going to go back into each layer and add some texture. I'm going to do this with clipping masks starting above the clouds. So I'm adding a new layer and tapping to bring up the side menu, setting it to clipping mask, and then I'm going to change the blend mode to multiply. Now I'm going to duplicate this layer, and on the upper one, I'm going to change the blend mode to overlay. Now on the multiply clipping mask, I'm going to use the Build Up Powder Puff brush, which is a stamp texture brush. I have the size set here to 13%, and with this purple color, I'm just going to softly stamp in this texture at the base of the clouds. Then I'm going to switch to this yellow, and moving out to my overlay clipping mask, I'm stamping in this texture along the lower right side. Back in my layers panel, I am going to do the same above my gray clouds. So create two clipping masks, changing the bottom one to multiply and the upper one to overlay. On the multiply layer, I'm going to use this darker gray, and still on the powder puff brush, I'm stamping in along the bottom of each cloud. Then switching to the yellow on the overlay layer, I am adding this on the right side of the clouds. Moving up to the splotches layer, I'm only going to add in one clipping mask for this, and I'm setting the blend mode of this clipping mask to multiply. I'm going to use this purple to add in some variation on the leaves and the splotches. Then above the green leaves, I'm going to add two clipping masks again. Once again, the blend mode set to multiply and overlay. And on the multiply layer, I'm going to use this darker green color. And I'm decreasing my brush size here to have a little more control. Now this texture, I'm mainly stamping in along the stems and letting it kind of fade out gradually towards the leaves. Then moving up to the overlay layer, I'm using this light green, and I'm going to add some additional texture along the edges of the leaves. Now for my starbursts, I'm going to merge the two yellow layers so that we can treat this as one, and then I'm going to add 2 clipping masks above this. The blend mode's again set to multiply and overlay. For the multiply layer, I'm using this darker orange-yellow color. And I'm just going to stamp in some texture along the bottom of each of these bubbles. Now on the overlay layer with the lightest yellow, I'm going to stamp in a little more texture on the very top. And now on my top starburst layer where the white line work is, I'm going to use the big fat pencil and I'm going to add in some shiny reflections in all of the bubbles and shapes. So now that we have all of our elements and all of our textures, we can do the steps to flip the pattern around to create the repeat. I am collapsing this layer group and I'm going to tap into the selection tool, then go down to save and load and choose selection 1. Then I'm going to tap the transform tool and flip this horizontally and flip it vertically. And then I'm going to repeat for each of the remaining selections. You'll see that it turns your pattern upside down, so you can just use 2 fingers to pinch and rotate the canvas. And now you can see any places that you might want to move some elements around or draw more in. This is where it's nice to have maintained all of the layers separately because you can make those adjustments. To move things around within the pattern, make sure that you, in your layers panel, have selected both the element and the clipping mask. This allows everything to move together as one element. So I want to move some of these bubbles around, so I'm selecting the outlines, both clipping masks, and the fill layer before I start to rearrange the elements. To rearrange them, I am using the freehand selection tool, and I'm going to draw a selection around the elements that I want to move. And then I'm tapping the transform tool to actually move. What I'm focusing on here is filling up the empty space of the cross section, which will help make the pattern appear more consistent when it's repeating. Now I'm continuing to move the elements around on each set of layers, being sure when I'm in the layers panel to select the corresponding clipping masks with the element layer itself. Once you're happy with the distribution of all of the elements, you can test the repeat. So if you have layer constraints, what you'll want to do is go into the gallery and duplicate the entire canvas and test the repeat in the duplicate so that you can go back in and make adjustments in your original if you need to. If you have the capacity to add more layers, duplicate the layer group. And then I am flattening the duplicate group into one layer. Then I'm going to hide the lower layer group, and then I'm going to duplicate the flattened layer to create 4 copies. And then using the transform tool, I'm going to scale each layer until it snaps to 50% in each of the 4 quadrants of the canvas. And here's the final repeat. Thank you so much for following along. I hope that this is helpful. Hopefully you learned a new skill. I can't wait to see all of your beautiful patterns.